Hello, everybody. Welcome to another thrilling episode of the JavaScript Jabber. I am Steve Edwards, the host with the face for radio and the voice for being a mime, but I'm your host today. With me on the panel, coming from across the pond in Tel Aviv, Israel, is Mr. Dan. How you doing, Dan?
I'm doing well. I'm doing fine. Thank you.
Good. Are you my opposite today? Weather-wise, we were getting snow on the ground here.
Let's put it this way. I'm sitting in front of an open window in a t-shirt and sweatshirt.
I feel your pain. I really do. Also with us on the panel is Mr. AJ O'Neill from the purple background. How are you, AJ?
Yo, coming at you live from under the weather.
Under the weather.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
And
I'll feel better tomorrow.
Our very special guest, also from the Tel Aviv area, Mr. Shay Davidson. How you doing, Shay?
Hello. Thanks for having me.
We are glad to have you here. We are anticipating, shall we say, quite the reaction from this one, and you'll understand as soon as you hear this. Thank you. All right. So Shay is here by Dan's invite, as Shay wrote some very disparaging tweets. No, I'm kidding. Just some tweets with opinions on React server components and things that I'm not very knowledgeable on, so I'm going to let Dan take it from here.
Well, React server components is a totally non-controversial issue. I'm just kidding. It seems that it's got like the entire React community still up in arms ever since they were introduced. We've discussed them on several episodes. Obviously, we've had Dan Abramov on the show. More recently, we had another episode about it. I forget the name of our guest. I'll say it in a minute. And I also spoke about them. And in general, it's a lot of people are talking about them because with Sam Selikov, who did that really controversial tweet a while back where he actually inlined SQL query inside React component, like the kind of reminiscent of the good old PHP days, and it got the entire React community really up in arms. So it's a pretty controversial topic, I guess. And Shai did his part of increasing that controversy. So I thought that having him on as an actual person who actually tried to use this technology rather than somebody who's either promoting it or intentionally disparaging it, I thought would be like an interesting change of pace. And also the scenario in which Shai, that you used it, is also, I thought, really interesting. So I think it's also worth talking about. So yeah, take it away. Introduce yourself, please.
Thank you. So I'm Shay Davidson. I'm 39. I had a birthday last week.
Happy birthday.
What day was your birthday?
It was a Sunday.
Oh, okay. The 28th was the perfect day, but because that was mine, but close enough.
I've been developing things since I remember myself. Started my career as a Flash game developer. Actually won the best Israeli indie game in 2010, but did nothing with it. Unfortunately. And then I started my actual career as a web developer or full stack developer in eBay, then with PayPal, worked in a parallel team with Kenzie Dodds, by the way. And then after my team got closed, I joined Lemonade, and I'm there for 5 years already. I'm a principal engineer there, and until recently, I was the front-end guild lead in the company. And now I'm leading all kind of technical initiatives.
So both of us are kind of in InsurTech because I work at Next Insurance.
We are. It's funny. I never thought I'd be in insurance, and also my wife is a legal counsel in an insurance company in Israel, and so we have insurance in the family. And I was like, no, I want to develop games. I don't want to be in the insurance industry.
Funnily enough, my first professional job as a developer was in a gaming company as well, but that was a really long time ago.
A lot of people started. A lot of people I know went into development just because they want to develop games. It's fine, but now nobody talks about that.
Yeah, funnily enough, I've never been a big gamer. I'm not really big into actually playing games, but actually programming games, that's a lot of fun and something that I really enjoy doing.
It's amazing, and it's probably the best track in development or coding that you can ever experience. But I can talk about it later. Let me start sharing the story. So a few months ago, I was in a family trip in Europe, and we were hearing a podcast during a car ride, and we listened to the history of computer games. And the narrator talked about games in the 70s, textual adventures or MUDs, where you could input text and the game would reply to you what you're seeing or what you can act upon, etc. And my daughter, which was almost 9 back then, was very excited. And the first thing she said was, "Daddy, do we have something like this in Hebrew?" And I said, "Maybe." And we went back after the vacation, and I searched in Google, and I couldn't find anything in Hebrew. And in the age of AI, I said, okay, that should be pretty easy to develop, because, you can even go to GPT today or Claude, which is even better in Hebrew, and write a prompt, write me a story about X. Imagine I'm a character in this world, and let's try to build this story together. And it works pretty well. Sometimes I read stories, bedtime stories for my kids, just using the prompt from GPT, etc. But I wanted to create a very unique experience that feels unique and feels like a gift, something that she can be proud of, that she received and she can play with and looks pretty nice. And I didn't want to just send her the link to OpenAI website and she can do whatever she wants. And so I started working on a project called Sipuela, which is, again, a simple application, a simple React application, built on top of OpenAI APIs, and just looks way, way better. And
if I can interrupt you for a second, though, if what you were doing is pure text-based adventures, why do you actually even need React?
Oh,
it's text.
Yeah, you're right, but the thing is that was like, we've been using Next.js in Lemonade for quite some time, but as the front-end lead in Lemonade, I said, okay, I know all this jabber around React Server Components and Next 14 and the move from the page router in Next to the app router, or was it vice versa? I was confused. But and I said, I don't know anything about it. Let's use this opportunity to also experience some new technologies. And of course, if I'm using Next, I need to use React. And I want to do experiments with that. Considering it is a simple application. I have only 3 pages. I have some API calls to get to OpenAI and get the new follow-up adventure. I thought that was a reasonable excuse to start using React and Next.js.
So it's kind of like that thing about developers wanting to blog. So the first step in blogging is creating a blogging platform.
Yeah.
So you kind of use this opportunity to learn about the new React, and new Next.js. Well, cool. If you're going to do a hobby, you might as well get the most out of it, for sure.
I thought that it's important for me, as somebody who is in a leading position in a company, to first be able to reason about this when people approach to me and say, what about, why don't we upgrade our Next? Or what about server components? Do we have an opportunity to use them in our code? And I said, well, I don't have any experience with it. I don't have any viable use case for this right now in our business plan. And in order to have an opinion about that, I might need to experience it directly. And that was a great opportunity for me, because it was really simple.
Before we delve into that, you did mention that at Lemonade you do use Next.js. So I'm kind of curious, are you using it like as the general basis for your front end or for particular things?
No.
Kind of, what depending on what you can actually say, obviously.
We started using Next.js about the same time I joined, like 4.5, 5 years ago, and the purpose was mostly around SEO. We wanted the server-side rendering for SEO.
So it was for the public site, as it were.
Yeah, it's only for our marketing website, and that's how we call it.
Okay, cool. Funnily enough, it's the same thing at Next Insurance, where I currently work, that our marketing website, or a public site, as we call it, is built on top of Next.js as well, and other things are not. The thing that needs to rank is built on Next.js.
A lot of the experience in Lemonade is very, very, very dynamic, and we thought that we didn't find a good use case for Next with these use cases. And also, we ran into a lot of problem with rehydration, considering we have a lot of highly interactive and dynamic animations in our website, and we do a lot of generative CSS, and we always ran into hydration problem and things that and they need to be isomorphic. Like all your components need to work both in the server and the client in the same way. And when you rely on the in some components or some pages, when you rely on the position of the scroll when the user refresh and it's only available once the server request ends, then you run into problems.
So in that case, just again, depending on what you can tell us, I'm kind of curious. Then what are you implementing that part of the user interface in at Lemonade?
We have our own framework, but basically it's vanilla React.
Oh, so it's kind of client-side, client-rendered React. Okay, it's interesting. I'm kind of derailing us slightly, but I think it's an interesting point to bring up, because I am seeing kind of this split, or how would you say,
bifurcation?
Bifurcation exactly, in the React ecosystem of, like, forget about React server components. I'm talking about SSR hydration meta frameworks on the one side, Next.js, you might say, because that's the king of the hill for React meta frameworks. And on the other side, a lot of organizations simply doing client-side rendered React. Maybe somebody did a Create React app a couple of years ago. Maybe they even manually configured Webpack. But it's basically, a lot of software built using React, and especially larger orgs, don't care about SEO, don't care about ranking. It's like dashboards and interactive applications and whatnot. And it's just client-side React all the way. At least that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I think in our case, in our dynamic pages, we didn't need SEO. And I think that's a question that I've seen, that's a problem that's an opinion I've seen a lot of times, that the focus on SSG and rendering performance or initial rendering performance is indeed a front-end concern, but it's not the only concern. But people, like, in all the meta discussion around React nowadays, it's only this: the initial rendering speed, working with network, rendering with server data, but front-end is more than this. And I feel that, for example, in our business case in Lemonade, we had to tackle other important things.
I'm totally with you. We had Alex Russell on the show a while back, and he makes the distinction between websites and web apps, where based on depth of interaction. But the actual kind of split that I'm mostly seeing is around whether or not you care about, ranking, and whether or not you cared whether or not the page is actually going to be scanned and being, and indexed. and a lot of cases, like you said, at Lemonade, also at Next, where I work, again, Next Insurance, not Next.js. It's stuff that's behind authentication. It's like a funnel sort of a thing. You never land directly into it. You don't search it. It's very personalized. So it doesn't really need to rank. So obviously, there are some considerations around loading time, because obviously you don't want it to load too slowly, but it's not the primary concern for sure. But on the other hand, think about what Vercel is selling. Vercel is selling hosting. So they kind of need you to want, to care about those things related to hosting, which are performance, which are the initial render, which are stuff like that. Because if you're doing client-side rendering, you can basically host it anywhere.
Eventually, I realized I'm forced to deploy it in Vercel and not in other services I'm a fan of, like Netlify.
Netlify don't support React Server Components?
I ran into problems configuring it and just gave up and paid Vercel.
Interesting. Anyway, back to your story.
Yeah. So, okay. Where was I? So I decided to develop this web app, not a website, like you said, for my daughter, using experiment with new technologies if I had opportunity. And the story is not only around the React Server Components, like I said, it's about around the new Next 14 actually, React Server Components, and also I've used Supabase, which was an amazing experience. And I'm saying it because, like I said, my first full stack or web dev gig was at eBay, and then there I was writing application in Rails, Ruby on Rails. And there's always this notion that it was far more easier to write web application back then compared to the Node ecosystem today, where you need to orchestrate everything, and Rails did everything for you. Now, looking back, I don't miss writing in Ruby. I love TypeScript, and I can't imagine myself writing a production-grade application without types. But
good thing that Chuck isn't here.
No kidding.
But I mean, it's still. I mean, there's still this nostalgic reasoning for we could do better, and I think this is what Remix is selling. By the way, they say they can be the new Rails in the Node ecosystem. But anyway, developing this game brought me back to my earlier experiences as a developer. I'm like, yeah, this feels familiar. So I didn't know about Supabase anything. I heard about it from a friend at work. And if you don't know what Supabase is, it's a SaaS product. It's also open source. You can create a project, and they basically give you a Postgres database for free with storage that's comparable to S3, with real-time functions, serverless functions, automatic GraphQL API generation. Really, really great. I didn't use all of this. I just used the database.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Like, what did you need all that power for?
I didn't need all this power. I just wanted free database because, like I said, it's not only Rails back then. If you remember, there was this company called Parse that Facebook bought and then closed that delivered the same premise. Here's a SaaS product that you can create a database with functions you can deploy, and you don't need to set up the database yourself. You don't need to set up MySQL, your Postgres. It's just there, and here's a simple API to access it.
Well, there's also Firebase, I think, in a sense.
Well, that's what it is. It's an open source version of Firebase.
Yeah, but I have experience with Firebase, but honestly, and without, I don't have a good experience with Firebase.
Fair.
Something about the API feels awkward to me when I use it, and I don't want to get into details because maybe it was just my single or two times I've been experienced with it and didn't have a good experience. Maybe I did something wrong, but compared to Supabase, I mean, it's a completely different world. But when I tell people about Supabase, they say, "Oh, it's like Firebase," and I say, "No, it's not like Firebase. It has a better developer experience than Firebase."
Well, for what it's worth, Supabase's tagline says, on their website says the open source Firebase alternative. So you can probably forgive people for thinking that.
That's exactly what I wanted to say. That's exactly their tagline. Supabase is an open source Firebase alternative. Anyway, back to your story. So you chose Supabase for your database, and it was really good for you.
Yeah.
And you chose to build everything on Next 14 with React 18 and the app folder and React components.
Correct. So my application has 3 pages. It has 4. I have a landing page, which is completely static. I have a user page, which shows all the books that I generate using AI or I have a create book page, and I have the book itself, where one page shows the textual adventure, what the AI says, and another one, the other side of the page in the book, is a form with a single input that the user, in my case, my daughter, can write what she wants to do and submits it, and then the AI generates a new page and moves forward. Kind of like a chat interaction, just I created an entire book with CSS, with pages and 3D animation. And I actually don't, I will show you, but I just realized that my OpenAI quota is out, so I can't use it anymore. Yeah. But it was 4 pages, and okay, here's a component. Do this API call to Supabase in the React component, considering it's a server component. Take the data out of it and render the component, render the components you wish to render based on this data in the server component. And the first thing I did was to render the list of books, the list of stories. And I said, okay, Supabase, a query from books by the user. Here's the data. It's typed because Supabase automatically generates the types for you. And then run a map function over these books and render the book component. And wow, it worked. Amazing. And that was my first experience with React Server Components. And I said, okay, this is fairly awesome because I don't need to declare an API function in the API folder. It's just there. It automatically creates an API for you. And I have it in a single file. Okay. Nice.
Yeah, undoubtedly, that's like the big premise thing is that you, can make a call to an asynchronous API with a sync await inside your React code, inside your component, directly render the results. It's very enticing, undoubtedly.
Yeah. But then things got complicated. First of all, I ran into problems with the Supabase queries. Like, let's say that I created a new book for my daughter, and I got back and I clicked back to the index page, and the book was not there. And nothing about it appeared in the Next.js documentation, etc. But if you search on it in Google, you run into multiple GitHub issues around it. So apparently, because Next.js override the native fetch function with their own caching mechanism, I got the old response data back.
Well, actually, it's not so much. I think that you got the old response so much as it basically cached the old response, and it basically just returned the cache version. So as I recall, what they did is that they now I don't remember if they still do it or if they basically backtracked on this behavior. It's an interesting thing to check. Because it definitely did get a lot of pushback. Basically, they kind of built kind of like React query-like functionality into their fetch implementation, that by default it caches the results instead of if the URL is the same or something along these lines.
I think that built-in caching, again, is one of the things like in Rails, they say, oh, they're doing it for me. I don't need to develop it myself. Like, oh, it's a complete dev experience bundle. But when seeing that, I was perplexed because I didn't understand what's going on. And it's barely, I mean, maybe I'll talk about it in the end, but one of the main problems that I had throughout this entire experience is not necessarily the technology. It's the fact that it's barely documented, and it's documented through GitHub issues. Like, how do I solve it?
That's kind of the thing about living on the bleeding edge, and undoubtedly when you started using it, it was kind of like the bleeding edge. I think they would argue that it's more mature now. I can look, obviously overriding a built-in function like fetch in a way that changes its behavior is something that I'm intrinsically opposed to. I can understand like the motivation, like the problem that they faced was that when you componentize access to APIs, you very easily repeat yourself. Like if you've got two components that need to access the same data, you end up in this kind of world of pain where forget about two. You've got 1,000 components that all need to access the same data. They all make the same API call. You can very easily like either overload your database or just create a performance nightmare. So they built caching into the actual fetch to avoid this kind of waterfall of a million calls for each like how do you preserve like the component model where each component is like distinct and self-contained, but at the same time don't end up issuing a million fetch calls? So I'm guessing that was their solution. I would have been explicit about it, do something like a React query. And I seem to recall that I'm trying to remember if it's still that way or they changed it back.
A month ago, it was still there because that's when my daughter's birthday was on February 14th. So it's not long ago.
Okay.
Anyway, afterwards, I discovered that there's built-in caching configuration mechanism in the new Next. But it's globally declared on the components file. So, and it was also very hard to find it in documentation. And the thing, I only managed to solve it by digging into GitHub issues. But once I solved the caching issues, I solved this problem and I could move on. And the next thing that I found confusing, but I understand why it works, is mixing between server components and client components. So basically, whenever you want to use a React hook, it must be in a client component. And I understand why. I mean, it's obvious why, because you can't serialize the state back from server.
Yeah, the server components are kind of stateless by definition. They render and they're done, and that's it. So obviously they can't be stateful. They have to be stateless. You can't have a use state in a React server component. Steve, AJ, is it clear enough, or do we need to kind of talk about why that is?
Well, I think we should talk about why that is, because I personally don't use the components.
Well, think about it this way. If you've got a component running server side, then if you want it to be stateful, you need to have like this persistent connection between the client and the server.
Like a WebSocket?
Yeah, and also it's like a one-to-one connection between between your server and your client, because you're keeping something in server memory that is the state, and that makes the whole server-side development that much trickier, and less scalable and more complex. You generally want to keep your server code stateless. Keep whatever state you have in a database or something. And that means that you can't really use stateful hooks on the server side. So React server components, because they run server side, they can't use stateful hooks.
Also, imagine that your state is not serializable. So how would you transfer it to the server?
Well, in a sense, it is kind of serializable in the sense that you can pass props from a server component to a client component. So you're effectively serializing props across the wire. So I can see, like, if it was just the protocol overhead of serializing data back and forth, that's solvable. And like I said, they kind of solve it already, because they serialize data downstream in the React server components, sending props to client-side components, and they serialize now data upstream in server actions or server functions. You send, which is kind of an RPC protocol, you send data upstream and you get the result downstream. So they are able to serialize state across the wire. The bigger issue from my perspective is the fact that you cannot have persistent state in the memory of a server-side component, because you might be hitting one server instance in one call and another server instance in another call, or the server might go down because it's some sort of a Lambda function or something like that. So React server components, by definition, cannot be stateful. They can. The only way they can have persistent state is by using something like a database or something like that. Is that kind of clear, Steve, AJ?
Yeah.
But it does
clear as mud. But yeah, it's clear.
It does mean that the instance you want to use to make a component stateful by adding, if in React speak, by adding a use state or something along these lines, you have to make it a component that can run on the client side. And use client is that divide that gets you from being server side only to having something that can also run on the client side. The interesting analogy that Dan Abramov now makes when he describes it is that use client is to React, or to modern React, like the script tag is to web development. It kind of indicates that from this point on, script tag says this stuff runs in the browser, or can run in the browser. Anyway, again, I kind of slightly derailed us, but I thought it was a point worth making. That, like you said, that the instance you wanted to add interactivity and client-side state and respond to user interactions, you had to switch over, and things that are beyond routing. You had to switch over to using to use client and client-side React.
So I want to go deeper into this, because in my case, I have a 4-page application, but even with these, small amount of files and components, you start having this mishmash of, okay, this is a server component, and this is another server component inside my page. Oh, but this might be a client component, and this is another client component that is only a client component because it has a use state, but it doesn't actually render anything because I need to get back data from it. So it's basically a use client hook. And then you get get lost on what's a server component, what's a client component. And it was hard for me to imagine how this doesn't get messy in a large-scale application. And
so Here's my 2 cents about it. First of all, when I talk to people about React server components, and so I'll backtrack a little bit. I have a talk that I gave at a few conferences, which is about overcoming the performance cost of hydration, in which I talk about various ways in which various frameworks try to reduce the cost of hydration. And one of the methods is React Server Components, because it pulls some of the rendering operation from the client to the server. So for React Server Components, they don't actually need to download any JavaScript code. They don't need to do any hydration. It just streams the results from the server directly to the client. But then I describe the downside of this approach, and I say that the biggest downside is that it's a new mental model, that you can't just assume that since you know React, you can easily just switch over to use this stuff. You need to think differently about how you architect your React application. And again, to be fair, Dan Abramov is straightforward about that, where he basically says that the transition in React from classes to hooks was a very easy one because it was bottom up. You wanted to use, if you wanted to start using hooks, you can say, okay, in this particular component, I'll start using hooks. It doesn't impact any other part of the rest of the application, and they can like start in a particular point and then expand out. Whereas with React Server Components, you kind of need to, it's top down, and you effectively need to rethink the architecture of your entire application. And you need to start thinking, like you said, Shay, about, hey, this is going to be server side. This can be server side only, but this part needs to also run on the client. And, where do I draw the line? Where do I switch? Where do I place the divide? And it infects everything. And it really is a different way of thinking about the architecture of your React application. It's not a trivial switch.
I think the hook comparison is really good, because when I joined Lemonade, I had experience. They've just introduced hooks, and I've had only experience with class components back then. But getting into hooks felt so natural to me. It was, wow, this is amazing. It's functional coding with React, and look at the power that hooks gives us, and we don't need mixins anymore, and we don't need components, and everything is great. And I learned hooks immediately and started applying it in all Lemonade's code. But with React Server Components, it feels different, because I don't think it's the mental model. And I think that from the start of introducing it, there was a great communication problem in introducing what they want to achieve, how it's being done, how the technology actually works, and everybody are biased around it right now. So even if I had a great experience developing React Server Components, there's this little thing back in my head that says it's a bit off. And I think that the communication problem around, I'm not sure they can fix it anymore. And maybe 2 years from now when everybody are using React Server Components, but right now, like it has been 2 years since they've announced it. I think it's still hard to digest React Server Components.
Realistically, I think that only now people are actually starting to use it. How's that British phrase go? In anger, seriously. I think it's interesting. If any of our listeners wants to, hit us back on that. But I am wondering how many organizations are actually using React Server Components for large-scale projects. It's an interesting question, which I don't know the answer to. I've yet to encounter a large-scale application developed with React Server Components, but obviously my information is very anecdotal.
do you think it would benefit the React and Vercel teams if they've announced server components after it has been matured enough?
I don't know how that might have worked, because it's like a chicken and an egg problem. I mean, if you wait for it to be mature before you release it into the wild, it will never be mature and you'll never release it into the wild. These technologies, they evolve over time, and it's also very much about the feedback that you get. For example, I don't know how many people remember that the actual initial implementation of React server components was Shopify Hydrogen. We actually had a person from Shopify on our show. I need to find the episode when it was really new, and we were talking about how it works and what they do, and we really didn't get it back then, by the way. And that project failed effectively, and it failed, and they learned a lot from that failure. For example, back then there was no use server and use client. Instead, it was based on the file name. So you either had server or client in the file name or something along these lines, and that would determine whether it ran on the server or ran on the client or both. And that turned out to be a bad idea.
Don't get me started about file name-based routing and configuration, by the way.
Well, yeah, but it turned out to be a bad idea, and they wouldn't have known that it's a bad idea if they hadn't tried it out. So, yeah, it's you kind of have to make these kind of big bets sometimes. The challenge for React is that they've got such a huge base, and it's more difficult, much more challenging for them to make these kind of big bets than it is for smaller frameworks. Like Ryan Carniato, the creator of Solid, he makes sweeping changes in the way that the framework works, like on a daily basis. But he's got like how many websites built using Solid? So and the people who use Solid are buying into this. They know what they're getting. With React, it's a different story. But like I said, I think that if they would have waited for it to mature, and also remember how long it actually took to get from React 17 to React 18. Like, what was it? 2-3 years?
Yeah.
How much longer would they have waited? Another 2 or 3?
But I think when I think about it, it's not only about React server components, because I'm not talking about library maintainers, but as an application developer, I mean, you look at all these new React features, even suspense, use transition, use deferred value, I don't even remember all the new hooks name. And I see it in the team, in the guild, in the Lemonade front-end guild. I mean, it's not that we don't know how to use this. We don't really know, it doesn't interest us to learn it because we don't know what are the use cases for these features. I mean, suspense is also had a rough initial ride, but now suspense is very known. But the rest of all these new features, it's not only React server components when you think about it.
Yeah, but I think it's mostly React server components. It's first of all, it's also it's worth mentioning again. I assume most of our listeners know what suspense is all about. Basically, suspense is about saying this stuff we don't need to wait on it. It can be asynchronous to the rest of the application. That's basically, from my perspective, the shortest explanation of what suspense is. That originally the entire React rendering operation was synchronous. It happened all at once, and suspense was a way to say these parts of the UI, well, they can happen later and they can happen at their own time. Shay, would you accept this definition or would you use a different one?
Bless you, AJ.
Yeah, but there's a way to maybe simplify it, because the most common use case is what should I render while I wait for this data, but this part that I'm waiting on is only a small part of what I'm trying to render.
Yeah, but that's kind of a fancier way of saying what I'm saying, because if something is asynchronous to the rest, it means that it happens in its own time, and you usually want to show some sort of placeholder while you're waiting on that thing to actually happen.
Yeah, it's the same thing, but most of the people use it for spinners and loaders, and I think that's the simple way to describe it.
Yeah, and I'll quote myself that one of my favorite shit tweets was that the way to tell the difference between a modern web application and a legacy web application is that the legacy web application is one big spinner while it's loading, and a modern web application is a lot of tiny spinners.
I prefer the first, by the way, from UX perspective, but
well, the idea there though is that if with a big spinner you're blocked on the slowest part, and with the modern application, each thing arrives as soon as it's ready. Which is, again, by the way, part of the thing about React Server Component streaming is that if you've got multiple React Server components in the page, another thing that's kind of confusing is that each can kind of arrive independently as soon as it's ready, and you've got a spinner until it's there, and then it appears. And you can arrange your page in such a way that the most important things and the high priority things and the things that appear first are in the initial viewport, while things further down the page appear as they become available.
I think it's an interesting discussion. I would actually love to talk about it for a few minutes, because from my personal experience, I think the big spinner problem you could solve with perceived performance improvements, like I don't remember. I'm not sure that's the exact right term, but ghost texting, and that it looks like there's content, but it has animation.
Oh, like the YouTube thing, like lots of gray boxes until there's actually
a lot of experiences are doing it at the moment. And when I, as a user, I enter a website and I have these all little spinners, and then content appears, it takes my attention. First of all, if you're not doing it correctly, it creates layout shift, which are bad. But maybe I'm not the normal user, but I think I want to see everything at once. And it's sort of compared to why I'm using, when people see me work, why you're not using a larger monitor, you're only using your MacBook's monitor, and I'm saying, I don't want to move my eyes around. I want to remain focused on a single place. And when everything pops out on your screen, it takes your attention. It creates this delay of your interpretation of the content, in my personal experience.
So Apple Vision Pro is not for you.
Yeah, probably not.
And well, look, first of all, in a lot of ways, I agree. I mean, first of all, I hate spinners, period. So preferably no big spinner, no little spinners. Just give me the content fast so that I don't need spinners. But think about it differently. In a lot of pages, you've got the important things and you've got the less important things. So, for example, if you're thinking about, let's say, a weather app, you want to know the temperature and whether it's going to rain or not. Everything else is kind of superfluous. It's nice to have, but it's not more than that. And if it's a big spinner and you're waiting on some slow something that's not the main content, that's a big issue. Think about, a lot of like in a lot of cases, a lot of modern pages, ads appear after the main stuff, and you could have delayed everything until the very last ad appeared. Some native applications work like that, and that annoys the heck out of me. Where you go into like this news app, and it takes a ton of time to load, but when it loads, it has everything, including all the ads. give me the text, load the ads while I'm already reading the application. Now, obviously, you need to be smart about it to avoid shifts and stuff like that. But I do get the value of not blocking everything on the slowest thing and prioritizing things based on how important they likely are to the user. Obviously, you need to build the UI in such a way that it works well. Like I mentioned before, maybe it's okay if there's a tiny spinner, but it's outside the initial visible viewport, and it's you'd only see it if you scroll down really quickly. That's okay in my book.
Definitely. I agree. And maybe I've sounded too harsh. Like, it's not that I want the entire website to load and then show content, but I think there's a middle ground between showing especially for back office applications, when you have a lot of.
No, I totally agree. If your page looks like 20 spinners and things appear at random in different places, that's a very annoying experience, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Especially if it also causes lots of shifts, then it's totally ridiculous. Good. So anyway, were you able to actually build the app?
Yeah, I did. And I actually didn't get to the best part because, I had my up and downs in the experience of developing this, but I think the best feature that I've encountered is the server actions. I was like, okay, I need an API to create a new book or to submit the form, etc. But then I read about server actions. And basically, server actions work sort of similar to server components in the fact that you can declare them inside a component, and they are functions that run in the server, but their API, their signature, are native form arguments, like how you would handle a submitted form from the client. You have the same API on the server. And you have access to the same server-side APIs that you have in server components. For example, I can access Supabase and read the form data from the client inside a server action, validate it.
So basically, a server action is a function that runs on the server that can be called from the client, effectively. Now, it's wrapped in a function, usually wrapped in a form submit. Does it have to be, by the way, or can it be just any?
For documentation, I didn't see any other use cases. Maybe they've improved that, but I use it only for form submission. The handler for the form tag was the server action all the time.
In any event, we talked about it with Sam, and I also talked about it in that episode I did on RPC. It's effectively a form of RPC, calling a function that runs on the server from the client using effectively function call semantics and having the framework, in this case, Next.js, serialize the parameters in the upstream, deserialize them on the server, and then serialize and deserialize the result, which is sent back.
So I think that the serialized thing is not, it's not entirely correct, because this is also where I ran into problems. Because the response from a server action, it's not the data itself, because it's running inside a server component. So if you want to get the data back, you should re-render it with the data you fetch in the server component. So a server action can do two things, maybe more, but I've used two. It can either redirect to a different page, or it can say, I want to invalidate the data in this certain page. And then, it wasn't intuitive for me in the beginning, because I said, I need let's say that I want to refresh the data in the page that triggered this server action. So, and even if the server action can be reused, I wanted to invalidate the cache in a dynamic way, just in the page that triggered it. And there wasn't such a function. And I had, like, in every server action, I had to figure out what was the path that triggered the action and then invalidate it.
So effectively, you caused a route operation on every submit effectively,
Yeah.
and then send the data back down as props in React Server Components.
Next does it for you.
Well, to be fair, look, when I first, I had various misconceptions about React Server Components and about server actions when I first encountered them. Because initially I assumed that it would be more akin to Quick's server dollar mechanism, where it's literally a way to call a function on the server side. But React really subscribes to the unidirectional data flow model. So they don't want you to call the function on the server side and send the data down that way. They want it to go in a circle, as it were. You send data from the server from parent components as props going down, and you send notifications as events bubbling up or function calls bubbling up. So it's kind of like this circle of how the thing flows. So I can totally understand why they don't want you to just do things on the server and get data from the server by just calling functions, getting data, and re-rendering it that way. They want the re-rendering to go through the React Server components.
It totally makes sense. I agree. And now that I know it, I can develop these things fairly quickly. But I mean, again, it wasn't really intuitive, and especially the caching validation thing.
Can you elaborate on the caching issues?
Yeah, let's say
I'm really unfamiliar with.
Yeah, let's say that I want to use the same server action in two different pages, but the result that I want is that the data that I want to invalidate is not in a single page, but on the same page that I triggered the action from. So it means that you need to start analyzing the path that the action was triggered from. In my case, and maybe I didn't do it correctly, I literally added the path of the page as an hidden input on the form, so I don't need to do it. I don't need to calculate it myself. So it's just there. So for example, if I want to invalidate the data on a specific user, you need to have the ID of the user and the URL that you want to invalidate. And then instead of trying to calculate it, I just sent it with the form data. It's probably
how do you do that invalidation, by the way?
I don't remember the function name, but it's called invalidate tag or something like that. I'm some weeks since I've done it, so I don't remember it precisely.
But it's a Next.js thing.
Yeah, it's a Next.js thing, not a React thing.
Okay. We are close to finishing, I think. Shay, anything else you want to say about this project? First of all, is that you said that you kind of ran out of your OpenAI quota, but we'll need to wait like a month and then be able to see it or something along these lines? Share the link and have your quota instantly run out as our listeners try it out?
So what happened is that I intended to release it only for my daughter, and OpenAI just released their GPT-4 preview turbo model. And apparently it costs a lot. And when I published it on Twitter, it blew up. I got like 20,000 impressions, and people approached me, strangers and colleagues and family, like, I want to try this. So considering I didn't have a create user form, I created all the users manually for some of the people that requested. And then I ran out of quota for my OpenAI, and I paid quite a lot. But my daughter played it, and she lost interest after a week, and that's fine, because I achieved what I wanted. I created an awesome personal gift. I learned a lot technologically, and I had a good experience in general. And so, yeah, it achieved its goal.
All righty. So hopefully you will all have a good reaction to this episode. I know I'm always learning. Anything I learn about React, I hear about React, I'm learning because I don't use it. But anything to wrap up before we move on to picks? Ty, anything you wanted to cover that we did not cover?
No, I think it was. I had a pretty good experience with you guys.
Good deal. Alrighty, so with that, we'll move on to picks. Picks are part of the show where we get to talk about anything we want to talk about that isn't tech related or is tech related or anything within reason that's not going to get us fined. So let's see. Dan, I know you had a good pick for us. Why don't you lead us off? After you turn yourself off of mute, Dan.
Yeah, my dog was barking really loudly outside, so I had to mute myself. Anyway, so yeah, AI is the thing. So AI is the pick. My first pick is this really amusing channel on YouTube where he basically has Arnold Schwarzenegger do all sorts of things, usually sing in all sorts of roles. So, for example, a really popular one is Arnold Schwarzenegger doing Judy Garland and singing "Over the Rainbow." There's another one where the Arnold Schwarzenegger is Thriller instead of Michael Jackson, or doing Whitney Houston. It's really amusing. And by the way, that's just one example I recently saw here. In it won't mean anything for our non-Israeli listeners, but a very known Israeli band from the 70s. They had them cover modern songs, and it really, but in their using their voices and their singing style. And again, it was really amusing, like seeing like new songs being done by an old band that way. So it's really amusing seeing all these things that can be done with AI. But it turns out that this thing can kind of get scary, because there was this story a while back about how a finance worker at some company in Hong Kong was conned into paying $25 million to some hackers after they tricked him by using deep faking the company's CFO on a video chat. So basically, he thought he was talking to his CFO, who told him to transfer $25 million to a certain account, which he did. And then only thought to try to verify it again after he actually made the transfer. But yeah, so watch out for those deep fakes. And I guess those would be my picks for today.
Alrighty, AJ, you got any picks for us? Even being under the weather?
I don't know. Let's see. Dune was re-released in theaters a couple weeks ago, and then I'm going to go see the next part tomorrow. So I'll pick Dune. It's done very well.
Has it? I'd heard sort of varying reviews on it, but
yeah, same here. I enjoyed the first part. I watched it a while back. I thought it was fairly accurate to the book.
I saw it last week in IMAX, and it was a great experience.
The second movie.
The second movie, yeah.
Wait, the second movie came out? Oh, well, it came out on Friday, I guess.
Yeah, for us it came out on Tuesday.
No way.
Yeah, some movies in Israel are released earlier than the rest of the world. It's not the first time.
That's interesting. Okay, yeah. Well, I think they did a really good job with the first movie. I think that if they're going to do the whole series, they got to tone it down a little bit, because I think when you're introducing something this epic that's been done so poorly in prior iterations, it's good for it to come out so bold and strong and dramatic. But if they keep the same tone that they had for the first movie for every movie, it would be overdoing it. But I think it was perfect for the first movie. And
I actually heard an interesting analysis about the movie, and that's something that the director actually did right, which that in a lot of ways, the hero, Paul Muad'Dib, Paul Atreides, is actually in lots of ways really well the opposite of a hero, because the best thing that he should have done or could have done was literally to kill himself like halfway into the book, because from that point on, basically what he creates is a disaster.
I don't know.
I think this what you're saying appears in the second movie, and it's really uncanny, by the way, without spoiling too much.
Have you read the book, by the way, AJ?
There's probably some parts that I didn't get fully because it is it's kind of a boring book, like Moby Dick. It's got a lot of words.
A lot of words. Amazing how books tend to have those.
Well, the book has more words than it has story. It's
saying a lot without saying a lot. Is that it?
Well, he does a lot of world building. So you really need to be into world building to enjoy the book in a way.
Yeah, I guess that's the hard part about having such an intricate book making it to a movie, because it's really hard to get in all that background.
Actually, in a certain way, a movie has a certain. If done right, movies can have an advantage in that regard because they can just show without needing to explain. One of the problems in the old the original movie, the one who was done by what's his name,
David Lynch.
By David Lynch, exactly, was that he literally told the story as he was showing the story. It was all like everything was narrated.
I see.
That was one of the problems with the movie. The other problem was that it was totally incomprehensible to anybody who didn't read the book. But yeah.
There was a planned earlier version by.
Of course.
Ali as the emperor.
Yeah. The most famous movie that was never made.
Yeah. Too bad, by the way.
Yeah, but he actually planned on totally changing the story, by the way.
Oh, didn't know that.
Yeah, his story was actually totally different.
So, all right, before we move on, I'll give you guys one bit of trivia. And I may have told this before, so apologies if it's a repeat. But the inspiration for Dune for Frank Herbert was the large dunes on the southern Oregon coast, not too far from where I live. He lived up in Tacoma, up in Washington, just north of here. And he's talked about how that was when he went down and saw the dunes, like Bandon down that way. That was his inspiration for writing Dune. So,
okay.
Anyway, myself, I'll move on to the dad jokes of the week, which, as we all know, are the high point of any of these episodes. I'm sorry if you weren't warned, Shay, but just to be prepared. So did you know that penguins produce an oil that helps their feathers retain their heat? And so in other words, you could say the oily boy gets the warm. For those of you who know what Popeye is, you can think about the oily boy. Let's see. The other day I went to my doctor, said I wasn't feeling good. AJ might appreciate this one. I said, "Doc, I've got an earache, inflamed sinuses, conjunctivitis, and headaches." But he was really dismissive. He said, "Nah, it's all in your head." Right? And then finally, my wife and I always brush our teeth together, separate toothbrushes, by the way, just because I found out that 9 out of 10 dentists say that brushing alone won't reduce cavities. Get it? So.
That was funny.
Right. All right, Shay, what do you have for us? Any picks? Any shameless plugs?
I thought whether to talk about a game I'm playing now, computer game, or to talk about to stick with the sci-fi concept theme that we had earlier, and I will stick with the sci-fi one. Okay. Because Denis Villeneuve's next movie is probably Rendezvous with Rama. Arthur C. Clarke, Rendezvous with Rama, which is my favorite book. And I'm really excited if and when it shows up. And afterwards, he's supposed to do Dune Messiah, which is the third part of the Dune saga. Do you know, did you read Rendezvous with Rama?
I myself have not. And I don't know where Dan went. He must have.
It's basically, without spoiling too much, it's basically a futuristic art sci-fi book about a cylindrical spaceship that enters the solar system and how humans interact and explore it. And I'm a big art sci-fi fan, so the book is one of my favorites.
Art sci-fi? I haven't heard that term before. What does that mean?
Art sci-fi is basically science fiction that tries to cling to reality. Unlike, for example, sci-fi, which has a lot of aliens and a bit are tangent to fantasy, like Star Wars, which is definitely not sci-fi. So it usually touches things like futurism, solar system exploration, things that really cling into real science.
Oh, okay, cool. I like those. Alrighty. So with that, we are going to wrap up this episode of JavaScript Jabber. We lost Dan, but AJ's still here. I'm still here. Shai's here. Thank you all for watching / listening, and we will talk at you next time on JavaScript Jabber.